The village rested in a wide valley where the land met the sky without hurry. From a distance, it looked peaceful. Mud houses arranged in careful rows, smoke rising gently from cooking fires, children's footsteps tracing the same paths their ancestors once walked. But beneath that calm surface lived a force stronger than stone walls or locked doors. The village was ruled by ancient rules. These rules were not written in books. They lived in memory, passed from elders to children like sacred inheritance. From the moment a child could walk, they learned how to bow their head, when to speak, and, most importantly, when to remain silent. Silence was safety. Obedience was survival. Marriage was never a matter of the heart. It was an agreement between families, a duty meant to protect bloodlines and honor. Love, as the elders described it, was unpredictable and dangerous. They believed it made people blind, selfish, and weak. A person who followed their heart instead of tradition did not just risk their own future, they risked the peace of the entire village. Every family had a place, and every place had limits. Some families were tied to spiritual duties, trusted to speak with the unseen world. Others worked the land, carried loads, or served quietly. These roles were respected but never equal. Crossing those lines was forbidden, like stepping into a fire and expecting not to burn. The village lived on watchful eyes. Gossip traveled faster than truth, changing shape as it moved from mouth to mouth. A woman who smiled too freely, a man who walked a path too often, nothing escaped notice. People learned to control their faces even when their hearts were breaking. Desire was hidden. Pain was swallowed. Elders sat beneath old trees, their words heavy with authority. No one questioned them. Their decisions were believed to come not just from wisdom, but from the ancestors themselves. To challenge an elder was to challenge the past, and that was a crime greater than any theft. At night, when the fires burned low and the wind whispered through the grass, stories were told. Stories of people who once dared to love beyond the rules. The elders spoke of them not with sympathy but as warnings. These stories always ended the same way, with loss, exile, or death. Children listened wide-eyed, learning that love could destroy everything they were taught to protect. Fear shaped the village more than kindness ever did. Fear of shame. Fear of angering the spirits. Fear of being cast out and forgotten. To be forgotten was the worst fate of all, worse than death. It meant your name would no longer be spoken, your memory erased like footprints after rain. And yet, despite all this, the human heart still beat with longing. People laughed at festivals and mourned at funerals, but deep inside, many carried dreams they never shared. Dreams of choosing their own paths. Dreams of loving without permission. These dreams stayed hidden, buried beneath layers of duty and fear. The village believed its rules were unbreakable. That tradition was stronger than any single heart. That the past could control the future forever. But the village was wrong. Because somewhere within those narrow paths and watchful eyes, a quiet feeling was beginning to grow. A feeling that did not respect boundaries or bloodlines. A feeling that would soon test every belief the village held sacred. One act of love, silent, forbidden, and fragile, was slowly taking shape. And when it finally surfaced, it would shake the village to its core. Amani grew up learning how to be invisible. From a young age, she was taught that her life did not fully belong to her. She came from a family trusted with spiritual duties, a lineage believed to stand closer to the ancestors than most. Because of this, every step she took was watched. Every mistake carried more weight. She was expected to be calm, respectful, and obedient, even when her heart felt heavy. Her days were filled with quiet tasks and long hours of listening. Elders spoke and she absorbed their words like law. She learned the rituals, the songs, and the rules meant to keep the village in balance. But beneath her steady expression lived a deep loneliness. She often wondered what it would feel like to choose something for herself even once. At night, Amani would sit outside her family's home and stare at the sky. The stars felt closer than the people around her. In those moments, she allowed herself to imagine a life not planned for her. But when morning came, she folded those thoughts away and returned to who she was expected to be. On the other side of the village lived Cato. Cato's life was shaped by effort, not ceremony. His family was known for their strength and labor. From sunrise to sunset, his hands were busy, his back bent under responsibility. There was no time to dream, only to work and provide. Respect was earned through endurance, not words. Though surrounded by people, Cato often felt unseen. No one asked what he wanted from life. They only cared about what he could give. His future was simple and heavy. Work, marry as instructed, raise children who would one day carry the same weight. Sometimes, when exhaustion pressed hard against his chest, Cato would pause and look beyond the fields. He wondered if life could be more than survival. But such thoughts felt dangerous, so he pushed them aside and kept moving. Amani and Cato belonged to different worlds. Their families did not speak to each other. Their roles did not overlap. Their paths were never meant to cross. And yet, fate does not always ask permission. The first time Amani noticed Cato, she was passing the fields on an errand for her family. She felt it before she saw him, a strange stillness like the air had thickened. When her eyes found him, her breath caught. There was nothing extraordinary about him at first glance. And yet, something inside her shifted. Cato noticed her at the same moment. She stood out not because she tried to, but because of the calm she carried. Her presence felt quiet and heavy, like a deep river. He told himself to look away. Instead, his eyes lingered a moment too long. They did not speak. But something passed between them, an unspoken awareness that neither could explain. A shared silence that felt louder than words. After that, these moments happened more often. A passing glance during ceremonies. A pause when their paths came too close. Each time the feeling grew stronger, heavier, harder to ignore. Inside both struggled. Amani felt torn between duty and desire. She knew her future was already planned. Any step outside it could destroy her family's honor. Still, her heart pulled her towards something she had never known, something real. Cato felt the same pull, sharp and confusing. He knew loving someone like Amani was impossible. It crossed every line the village held sacred. Yet the thought of never seeing her again felt like a kind of death. They told themselves it would pass. But the human heart does not obey fear forever. Slowly, quietly, two lives that were never meant to touch began moving closer, drawn together by a force stronger than tradition, stronger than reason, and far more dangerous than either of them yet understood. The moment arrived quietly, almost by accident, on a night when the village seemed to hold its breath. Amani had slipped away from her family's home, seeking the stillness she always craved. The air was cool, scented with earth and smoke, and the path she walked twisted through a grove she had always been told never to enter alone. It was here, hidden beneath the canopy of trees, that she first saw Cato waiting, not by chance but by the same pull that had been drawing them together for weeks. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The night was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant cry of an owl, but around them the world felt still. Every instinct screamed at them to turn, to retreat back to safety. Every rule they had learned since childhood warned them against this. Yet they did not. In that silence their eyes met. Amani saw the same weariness she carried herself mirrored in Cato's gaze. The weight of expectation, of duty, of loneliness pressed upon them both. For the first time they understood, completely, that they were not alone in their longing. Cato stepped closer, cautiously, as if one wrong movement could shatter everything. Amani's chest tightened, part fear, part anticipation. In that brief moment, the barriers that had held them apart, the rules, the family expectations, the invisible walls of the village, seemed to fall away. They began to talk, softly at first, sharing thoughts they had never spoken aloud. Amani confessed a longing for freedom, a desire to choose her own path, even if it was small and fleeting. Cato shared the weight he carried, the silent suffering of a life spent working for others' expectations, never for his own. Each word drew them closer, weaving a connection neither could ignore. They both knew the danger. Every smile, every glance, every whispered word was a step toward a future the village would never allow. But for the first time, it felt like something real, something alive. The world beyond the trees did not exist here. Only the two of them. By the end of the night they made a choice. Not a loud, defiant declaration, but a quiet, unspoken agreement. They would meet again. They would share what little moments they could steal from the world. They would hide their bond from the village, burying it deep in secrecy where it could grow without judgment. From that night on, the grove became sacred, a hidden sanctuary. Every rustling leaf and twisted root held their promises. Their love, fragile and forbidden, began to take root in the darkness. Yet even as they allowed themselves this dangerous closeness, the shadows reminded them of what they risked. One misstep, one discovery could destroy everything. Every night, as they parted and returned to their separate lives, their hearts ached with longing and fear. They began to understand that secrecy itself had power. The hidden meetings, the silent paths, the unspoken words, they all became symbols of their defiance and their hope. Each meeting was a thread weaving a story the village could never know, a story that could change them forever if it survived. And in the quiet, beneath the night sky, one truth became clear. What had begun as a spark, small, dangerous, and almost accidental, was now a fire neither could extinguish even if they tried. The night ended with a promise that they could barely voice, they would return. They would endure the fear and risk the consequences. And in doing so, they would begin a journey that would shake not only their hearts but the very foundation of the village itself. It was a spark that should have been extinguished, but instead, it burned brighter than either of them dared to imagine. From that first secret meeting, Amani and Cato's lives changed forever. What had begun as a fleeting spark became a slow-burning fire, hidden from the world but alive in every stolen glance, every whispered word, every secret path they took under the cover of night. They met whenever they could. Sometimes by the old grove, where the twisted roots and thick branches shielded them from prying eyes. Sometimes near the river, where the water whispered against stones, covering the sound of their laughter and their confessions. Each moment together felt precious, a small rebellion against the strict rules that governed their lives. Amani noticed changes within herself. The weight of expectation no longer pressed as heavily on her shoulders, not when Cato was near. She began to smile more freely, though always carefully, when others were watching. Her heart, which had once felt caged and silent, now pulsed with something dangerous yet exhilarating, hope. Cato too felt the shift. His tired shoulders seemed lighter after seeing her. For the first time he allowed himself to dream, to imagine a life beyond endless labor and obligation. But with each stolen moment the danger grew. Every shared smile, every touch of hands hidden beneath the trees, risked discovery, and the consequences would be unbearable. Fear shadowed their love like a patient predator. Every sound in the night, the snap of a branch, the distant barking of a dog, the creak of a shuttered window, made them freeze. Each time they parted, their hearts ached, not just for the distance, but for the world that would never accept what they felt. And yet they could not stop. The village began to stir with whispers, small and seemingly insignificant at first. Someone noticed Cato lingering near the grove when he should have been working in the fields. Another saw Amani walking farther than was proper for a girl of her family's standing. Nothing was confirmed, but suspicion began to grow like a shadow spreading at sunset. Still, in the hidden corners of their world, their love flourished. They learned to speak without words, using glances and gestures that only they understood. Each secret meeting became an act of courage. Each touch, each laugh, each stolen moment was both a thrill and a threat. As their bond deepened, both began to change. Amani found strength she never knew she had, a quiet determination to live for herself, even if only in these moments. Cato discovered patience, care, and tenderness that surprised him. Love, they realized, was not just a fleeting joy, it was shaping who they were. But the stakes were rising. With every secret meeting, every laugh shared in hiding, the village seemed to sense something was amiss. Elders' gazes lingered too long. A farmer would whisper to another, casting wary glances at the grove. Small signs, unexplained pauses, quiet warnings, hinted that their secret was no longer completely safe. Even so, Amani and Cato felt an urgency they could not resist. The risk only made the stolen moments more precious, more intense. They knew it could not last forever, yet they clung to it, knowing it might be all they ever truly had. Their love, intense and forbidden, became a dangerous dance. Every heartbeat was both thrill and threat. Every glance carried weight. Every step outside the rules of the village was an act of defiance. And with each day, the invisible walls of tradition began to feel less certain. They began to imagine a life where they could be together without hiding, where the village could accept their love. It was a thought so intoxicating it was almost unbearable, and yet almost impossible. Even in the shadows, though, they could see the cracks forming around them. The village would not ignore this forever. The closer they drew to each other, the closer the danger grew. The whispers, the suspicious glances, the watchful eyes, they all promised that one day the world they loved in secrecy might collapse entirely. And still they continued. Because in those quiet, hidden spaces, their hearts had found something worth risking everything for. Love had grown in the shadows, and it would not be extinguished easily. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. And it was only just beginning. The first sign that their secret was no longer safe came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the first crack in a long frozen lake. It began with small glances, neighbors noticing Cato lingering near the grove a moment too long, or Amani returning from errands with a hint of a smile that didn't belong to a girl of her family's standing. Nothing could be proven yet, but the village had a way of sensing what it did not see, and suspicion began to stir. The whispers started softly, among women at the market and men in the fields. They were careful at first, disguised as idle chatter. "Did you see her near the river at dusk? And that boy, he's always gone somewhere, isn't he?" But rumors had their own momentum. What began as a hint of curiosity quickly grew into a sense of concern, then judgment. Amani noticed it before Cato did. She felt the weight of eyes on her during ceremonies, even when no one was speaking directly to her. Elders' questions so ordinary before now felt pointed. "Where were you just now?" one would ask. And she would answer politely, though her heart raced, praying they would not look too closely. Every interaction carried tension she had never felt before, as if a single slip could expose everything she had fought to hide. Cato too sensed it. The fields felt less safe. Men who once barely acknowledged him now exchanged subtle nods and raised eyebrows. He could feel the weight of suspicion pressing down on him, though he did not know why. The pull he felt toward Amani now carried a new sharpness, fear. Warnings came indirectly at first. A friend might murmur caution, "Be careful with where you go," or, "Not everything can be hidden." It was enough to make Amani's stomach twist, enough to make Cato's hands clench. They understood the unspoken truth. One mistake could undo everything. They met as usual in the grove, but the air between them was different. Their laughter felt tense, their conversations careful. Cato's hand brushed hers and they both flinched, aware that even the smallest sign could be observed. Fear had crept into the spaces that once felt free. And yet the pull remained. Even knowing the danger, they could not stop seeking each other. Their secret meetings had become lifelines, moments when the weight of the village, of tradition, and of duty could be forgotten. Each encounter was more precious because the risk had grown. The emotional tension built like a storm on the horizon. Every step outside the rules was an act of rebellion, and every rebellion carried the possibility of disaster. Amani felt it in the tightening of her chest every time she heard a whisper or saw a suspicious glance. Cato felt it in the restless nights he spent imagining what would happen if they were caught. The first crack in the silence was more than a hint of suspicion. It was a warning. The village was beginning to notice, and with notice came scrutiny. With scrutiny came judgment. And with judgment came consequences neither of them had yet faced, though they could feel them looming. For the first time, they understood the fragility of what they had built in the shadows. Their secret, once a safe harbor, was now a fragile thread stretched over a deep chasm. One misstep, one careless glance, one whispered word could unravel everything. And still, as they parted that evening under the grove's twisted branches, they clung to each other's hands a little longer, knowing that the world outside the shadows was starting to close in. The first crack had appeared. And with it, the fear that their love, hidden, precious, and dangerous, might not survive the light of day. The village's gaze was turning toward them, and they were unprepared for the storm it would bring. The village, patient and relentless, had begun to sense the fracture in its carefully constructed order. The elders, guardians of ancestral law, did not act rashly, but when they finally did, their presence was like a wave that swept through the village, leaving no heart untouched. Tradition was asserting itself, not with whispers but with force. Amani first felt it in her daily life. Her family, unaware of her secret but alert to the subtle signs of misalignment, began steering her toward duties she had not asked for. She was reminded of rituals she must lead, ceremonies she could not skip, and most painfully, a future carefully planned by her elders. A marriage had been arranged for her, one that would strengthen her family's position and honor the ancestors. The very thought of it made her chest tighten. The life she imagined with Cato, filled with laughter, freedom, and choice, seemed suddenly impossible. Cato felt the pressure in a different way. His family, strict and proud, began urging him toward paths that solidified his responsibilities. He was reminded of the expectations of labor, the duty to marry appropriately, the need to uphold the family name. Every glance toward the grove, every thought of Amani, became a temptation he could not afford. The weight of the village pressed against him like stone. At first, they tried small acts of resistance, delaying an errand, lingering just a few minutes longer in the hidden grove. But the village's eyes were everywhere. Elders spoke to others, and rumors grew quietly like a creeping vine. Every attempt to bend the rules without breaking them drew attention. Resistance itself had become suspicious. The threat was no longer theoretical. Notices of obligations, of ceremonies, of expectations arrived without warning. Every public gathering reminded them of what was at stake. Amani's future was no longer hers to choose. Cato's freedom was not his to claim. Tradition demanded their obedience, and the cost of defiance loomed large. Fear became constant, a shadow over every step. Every stolen moment now carried the risk of exposure, punishment, and shame. And yet, their longing for each other only grew stronger. It was impossible to stop. The heart does not yield to duty alone. Every glance, every word, every secret meeting fed the fire of a love that the village considered dangerous. Anger too began to rise. Amani felt fury at a world that refused to let her choose, at rules that demanded obedience over happiness, at a tradition that punished longing. Cato's frustration was quieter but no less intense. Anger at the life forced upon him, at the impossibility of stepping beyond expectation, and at a system that punished hearts for daring to beat freely. Every day the tension built. The village, sensing unrest in these two young hearts, intensified its oversight. Elders called for ceremonies, arranging obligations that left no time for wandering, no space for secrecy. Families began to question the behavior of others, subtle glances at the wrong moments, careful notes about absences. The love story that had bloomed in shadow had become a ticking time bomb. Each heartbeat was a reminder that the world outside their hidden grove could destroy everything in an instant. Every stolen laugh, every touch, every whispered word became a gamble with consequences too severe to imagine. And yet, despite the fear, Amani and Cato clung to each other. Every touch in the grove, every secret meeting at night, was both a defiance and a lifeline. They had begun to understand that love was not only joy, it was courage, risk, and sometimes pain. They were willing to endure the risk, though the cost was becoming clearer with every passing day. The village's rules were ancient, unyielding, and relentless. They had shaped generations. And now they were poised to strike at the hearts of two who dared to challenge them. In the quiet moments, under the shelter of twisted trees and starlit skies, Amani and Cato would hold hands and whisper promises, knowing the danger that pressed in on every side. But even as they clung to one another, a terrible understanding had settled between them. Tradition would not bend. The village would not forgive. And their love, precious and fragile, would be tested in ways neither of them could yet foresee. The ticking of the clock was louder than ever, and the storm of tradition was gathering strength. Soon nothing would be hidden. Soon, every choice, every heartbeat, every whispered word would have consequences. And the world they had built in shadows was about to collide with the unyielding light of the village. Their love had become a threat, and the village would not wait to strike. Even the deepest shadows cannot hide forever. The betrayal came quietly as betrayals often do, not with rage but with carelessness, curiosity, or fear. One small act, unnoticed by those who did it, would ripple outward and shatter the fragile world Amani and Cato had built. It began with a simple observation. Someone, a friend, a neighbor, perhaps a relative, saw them together in the grove. Perhaps it was a glance too long, a laugh too free, a hand brushing against another in a moment too tender. The observer said nothing at first, unsure of what they had witnessed. But in a village that thrived on whispers and speculation, silence is never safe. The story spread like a fire in dry grass. A glance in the market, a murmured question at the well, a hurried word to a family elder. Before long, the truth could not be contained. What had been carefully hidden in the dark was now emerging in the open. Amani felt it first, though she did not know why. The next time she walked through the village, eyes lingered too long, conversations paused too abruptly, and whispers floated through the air, soft but sharp. Every heartbeat felt exposed. Every step seemed to echo louder than it should. Cato realized it fully when men in the fields began to glance his way with suspicion, when friends who once smiled at him now looked away tight-lipped. Something had shifted, though neither could yet name it. Then came the confrontation. It was subtle at first, words laced with accusation, questions that carried judgment. Families began to speak, their tones heavy with fear and shame. The elders called meetings, their faces dark with concern, their voices low but commanding. The balance of the village felt threatened, and in response, the village itself rose as one. The revelation did not come with mercy. Amani and Cato found themselves surrounded by suspicion, anger, and fear. Where once they had walked unseen, now every step was scrutinized. Their secret, once tender and private, became a weapon in the hands of those who believed honor and tradition had been betrayed. Shame fell upon them like a storm. The village, united in outrage, demanded explanation, accountability, retribution. The two lovers stood in the eye of judgment, hearts racing, knowing that no story could undo what had been exposed. Families felt dishonored, their names tarnished by a love that refused to obey. Elders felt challenged, their authority questioned by two young hearts that had dared to defy them. Amani felt the sharp sting of betrayal, not from the village but from the very world they had trusted to remain hidden. She had believed secrecy was enough. She had believed careful steps could protect them. And now she realized trust itself had limits in a place where every glance, every whisper, every shadow could carry danger. Cato's heart tightened with a mix of fear and helplessness. He had imagined punishment but not the breadth of public scrutiny. He had imagined shame but not the intensity of anger that burned in so many eyes. The village had turned not just to enforce tradition, but to crush the fragile possibility of freedom. Even their most loyal friends could not act openly. The village had become a single, unforgiving force. Together, it crushed the space that had once been theirs alone. For the first time, Amani and Cato felt the true weight of their choices. Love, once a sanctuary, had become a battlefield. Every tender moment, every stolen touch, every whispered promise now carried consequences that were no longer abstract. They were immediate, unavoidable, and devastating. And yet, in the midst of humiliation, judgment, and fear, they clung to the truth of what they felt. The love that had been discovered might be punished, might be mocked, might be threatened, but it remained unbroken in their hearts. The betrayal had torn open the veil. The shadows had failed them. And now, the storm of the village's tradition and anger would fall upon them with full force. The world they had hidden in had vanished. And in its place, only reckoning remained. The village moved swiftly once the truth could no longer be ignored. What had begun as whispers and suspicion now demanded action. The elders, guardians of every tradition and law, gathered with an intensity that made even the strongest hearts tremble. In their eyes, the love between Amani and Cato was no longer a secret. It was a crime against honor, a challenge to authority, a threat to the delicate balance that had kept the village intact for generations. Amani felt the first weight of it when her family, usually quiet and measured, called her home with urgency. Her father's face was drawn, lips tight. Her mother avoided her gaze, hands trembling as if the act of speaking might shatter something fragile. The elders had decided that she must be separated, that her duty to family and tradition was greater than any personal desire. The arranged marriage, once a distant future, now felt like a trap closing around her chest. Cato faced the judgment in a harsher, more immediate way. The men of the village, carrying the authority of their families and the weight of tradition, confronted him directly. Their words were sharp, condemning, and unyielding. To be seen with Amani, to share her love, was to dishonor not only himself but everyone around him. They reminded him of duty, of lineage, of consequences, leaving no room for appeal. For the first time, fear took root in a new way. This was no longer hidden danger, no longer whispers in the shadows. This was public, unavoidable, and terrifying. Their love had become a crime, punishable not only by social exile but by the weight of shame that would linger for years. Yet the emotional bond they shared refused to yield. Every glance they stole, every touch pressed to hidden skin, carried a mixture of desperation and defiance. Amani clung to the memory of their secret meetings in the grove, to the quiet nights by the river, to the promises that had once felt infinite. Cato remembered the strength she had brought to him, the courage he had found in her eyes, the spark of hope they had created together. Even as punishment loomed, they refused to let go completely. In the quiet moments before separation, they lingered, hands brushing, hearts beating in sync, knowing the world was closing in. Each second was precious, yet terrifying. Every heartbeat reminded them that their time together might end here, that the life they had imagined could be ripped away at any moment. Sacrifice became an unavoidable thought. Amani considered how far she might go to protect Cato, how much she could endure to keep him safe. Cato, in turn, weighed the impossible choice of surrendering himself to shield her. Love, once a private joy, had become a test of endurance, courage, and survival. The village enforced separation with precision. Amani was escorted home under watchful eyes, her movements restricted, her voice careful, her interactions measured. Cato was given duties that kept him away from her, every day structured to prevent even a fleeting encounter. Their world, once alive with stolen moments and secret touches, became a landscape of longing, ache, and isolation. Emotionally, the toll was immediate and heavy. Nights were long, filled with grief, regret, and frustration. Thoughts of the other consumed them, mingled with anger at a world that punished love and forced obedience. Dreams were haunted by memories of stolen laughter and hidden kisses, and waking hours were dominated by the stark reality of separation. The cost of loving openly had become terrifyingly clear. Freedom, hope, and joy had been replaced by fear, sorrow, and impossibility. Each day apart felt like a punishment beyond what they had imagined. Their hearts ached not only for each other but for the world they had lost, the life they had glimpsed and could never claim. And yet, even in the face of this unbearable pressure, their love did not vanish. It shifted into a quieter, more dangerous form, memory, longing, and an unspoken promise that somehow, someday they would endure. Even when every path seemed blocked, when every tradition weighed like a stone upon their shoulders, they clung to the belief that love, though criminal in the eyes of the village, was still theirs in the heart. The village had acted. Rules had been enforced. Punishment had been delivered. The lovers were separated, confined by expectation, honor, and authority. But in the spaces between these actions, in the quiet corners of the heart where tradition could not reach, Amani and Cato's love remained, defiant, aching, unbroken, and impossibly alive. The lesson was cruel but undeniable. To love openly was to risk everything. And sometimes the greatest acts of courage were measured not in defiance but in endurance. Their love had become a crime, but the human heart, unseen, ungoverned, and unrelenting, refused to surrender. The punishment and public shame of Amani and Cato sent shockwaves through the village. At first, it seemed as if the entire community had united against them, as if every whisper and glance carried the weight of judgment. But beneath the surface, cracks began to form, small at first, almost imperceptible, yet impossible to ignore. Some villagers quietly disagreed with the harshness of the punishment. Mothers who remembered their own youthful dreams, fathers who had once loved beyond reason, and young people who still hoped for freedom saw the injustice in the treatment of the two lovers. They could not speak openly, not yet, for fear of the elders' wrath. But in hushed tones and exchanged glances, a different conversation had begun. Compassion began to rise, challenging fear. Families that had long followed tradition without question found themselves questioning it for the first time. Was honor truly more important than happiness? Was obedience more sacred than love? The questions, once dangerous to ask aloud, began to echo quietly in kitchens, fields, and meeting places. The elders sensed the shift immediately. They had relied on unity to enforce the rules, but now the villagers were no longer unanimous. Some offered silent support to the lovers, while others quietly questioned whether punishment had gone too far. The authority of the elders, previously unquestioned, was suddenly under pressure. Even small acts of rebellion, a parent failing to scold a child, a farmer lingering too long by the grove, felt like defiance. Amani and Cato, though physically separated, became symbols of a larger struggle. Their love, once considered a private sin, now embodied a moral question that reached far beyond their own hearts. Villagers debated in whispers. Could a life of love be more honorable than a life of forced duty? Could compassion outweigh fear? Even Cato's and Amani's families began to feel the strain. Some members sympathized secretly, tormented by the thought of punishing those they loved. Others clung rigidly to tradition, fearful of shame and judgment. The household itself became a battlefield of conscience, torn between loyalty to elders and the undeniable truth of human emotion. Tension in the village grew. Meetings became longer, with elders insisting on obedience while younger voices, timid yet growing in courage, argued for mercy. The once clear lines of authority blurred. Where fear had once maintained order, empathy now competed, quietly but persistently, with the old rules. This division did not bring peace. Instead, it brought unease. Villagers walked with caution, glances lingering longer, conversations hushed, trust fragile. People were no longer certain of what was right, no longer certain of who was loyal. A quiet tension settled over the village, as heavy as any storm, waiting to break. Amani and Cato, though distant from the village's public life, felt the ripple of this change. The knowledge that their suffering had sparked reflection, and perhaps even doubt, was both painful and powerful. They realized that their love had already begun to reshape the hearts of those around them. Even in punishment and separation, they had become catalysts for change. The elders, sensing the shift, grew more vigilant. They understood that authority could not survive long where compassion had begun to flourish. Tighter rules, stricter oversight, and more public ceremonies were enforced to remind the villagers of tradition, but every action carried the opposite effect. Every attempt to tighten control revealed the tension that had already taken root. And so, the village existed in a strange in-between state, half bound by fear, half stirred by the possibility of change. The story of Amani and Cato was no longer just theirs, it had become a moral crisis, a question too large to ignore. It was a challenge to every rule, a challenge to every belief, a challenge to every heart. Even in separation, even in sorrow, the two lovers had planted a seed that could not be crushed. It whispered through the streets, the homes, the fields, and the hearts of the villagers, that love, even when punished, could inspire courage, that compassion could survive fear, that sometimes the greatest act of defiance was to simply be human. The village, once united in unquestioning obedience, was no longer whole. And with that fracture, the story of Amani and Cato moved beyond a private love into the realm of history, one that would forever challenge the meaning of tradition, honor, and heart. The village had begun to stir with quiet unrest, but nothing could prepare Amani and Cato for the devastation that would come. Loss arrived like a storm without warning, sweeping away hope, shattering hearts, and leaving a silence heavier than any punishment or judgment. It began with a summons. Cato was called to fulfill a duty arranged by the elders, one that would separate him from Amani for months. The task was demanding, exhausting, and merciless in its timing. At the same moment, Amani was reminded of her marriage obligations, her future now dictated not by love but by tradition. The life they had imagined together, the hidden moments in the grove, the whispered promises under the river's edge, was slipping through their fingers, fast and irreversible. They met one last time before the separation, under the old grove that had once felt like a sanctuary. The air was thick with unspoken words, with grief that neither could fully express. Their hands clung tightly, as if the simple act of holding one another could keep the world from tearing them apart. Tears came freely, tracing lines of sorrow on their cheeks. Every glance was both a goodbye and a promise that could never be fulfilled. The separation was brutal, not just physically but emotionally. Days stretched into weeks and weeks into months, each one a relentless reminder of what they had lost. Letters were forbidden, messages intercepted, and the river and grove, once their secret world, became inaccessible. The village enforced its rules with precision, ensuring that the punishment of loss was complete. Grief consumed them both. Amani wandered the halls of her home, silent and withdrawn, replaying memories of Cato in her mind. Each laugh, each touch, each whispered word haunted her. She could feel his absence as a physical ache, a hollow space in her chest where hope once lived. Cato, in turn, threw himself into labor, but exhaustion and routine could not dull the pain. Every sound in the village, the laughter of others, the rustle of the trees, the familiar paths they once walked together, reminded him of the life denied. Anger, sorrow, and helplessness swirled inside him, a storm that could not be quieted. The loss did not affect only them. Families were broken by grief, torn between pride and love, between the village's rules and the human heart. Some parents wept quietly for the children whose happiness they had sacrificed in obedience to tradition. Siblings felt guilt and frustration, knowing they could do nothing. Even the elders who had enforced the punishment were not untouched. In private, they pondered the consequences of their unwavering rule, feeling a weight that no ceremony could lift. The village itself became a place of mourning, though few spoke it aloud. The story of Amani and Cato's love, once a secret, now lingered as a memory of what could have been. Silence replaced gossip, reflection replaced judgment. Every glance at the grove, at the river, at the quiet spaces of the village reminded its people of the human cost of unyielding tradition. And yet, even in the grief, their love left a mark. The villagers began to see that rules, no matter how sacred, could destroy hearts as surely as storms destroy crops. The cost of obedience became painfully clear. Compassion, empathy, and human longing could not be entirely suppressed, no matter how harshly they were punished. Amani and Cato's separation became a wound that no ceremony could heal, a loss that would never be undone. It was a grief that lingered in every street, every home, every heart of the village. And in that silence there was a subtle shift, a quiet understanding that love, even when punished, left traces that could not be erased. Though their hearts were broken, and though the village had enforced its law with merciless clarity, something indelible remained. The memory of their love, the courage they had shown, and the pain they endured began to seed reflection, awareness, and the possibility of change. The village had demanded obedience and it had received it, but at a cost far greater than anyone had anticipated. Amani and Cato had lost everything that could be taken by law or tradition, yet their love, in memory and in spirit, had left a mark no punishment could erase. It was a loss that could never be undone, but it was also a lesson that could never be forgotten. Time passed slowly, as it always does after a storm. The village, once buzzing with whispers and judgment, settled into a heavy, reflective silence. The echoes of Amani and Cato's love, and the consequences that followed, lingered like a shadow over every street, every home, every heart. For Amani, the passage of days was both a torment and a quiet teacher. She moved through her duties with careful precision, performing rituals and attending ceremonies, yet inside, a part of her remained elsewhere, lost in memories of laughter, stolen glances, and the warmth of a hand she could no longer hold. Grief pressed upon her chest, a constant reminder of the love that had been punished, the choices she had not been allowed to make, and the cost of obedience. Cato too endured a slow reckoning. He buried himself in labor and responsibility, channeling frustration into physical toil. Yet at night, when the village slept and the fields lay quiet, he could not escape the memories of Amani. He relived every meeting, every touch, every whispered word. The pain was sharp, but it also began to change him. It forced reflection, an awareness that life could not always be governed by duty alone, and that rigid obedience had consequences beyond immediate control. Even the elders, who had seemed unyielding, began to confront the aftermath of their decisions. Behind closed doors, they questioned the severity of their judgment, the suffering they had sanctioned, and the silent fractures forming in the village. Some elders admitted, quietly, that perhaps the rules had been applied too harshly, that the cost of tradition was heavier than they had imagined. Others remained steadfast, but the shift was undeniable. The village's moral foundation had been shaken. Families began to soften as well. Parents who had enforced obedience with iron resolve now struggled with guilt. They witnessed the long-term effects of punishment on the children they had sought to protect, seeing grief and longing etched into faces that had once been bright with innocence. The human cost of strict tradition was no longer theoretical. It was painfully, visibly real. Forgiveness began slowly, almost imperceptibly, in small acts of quiet empathy. A neighbor allowed a child extra freedom, a relative offered comfort in silence, a parent lingered by the grove without questioning its presence. The village learned gradually that mercy did not erase tradition. It softened it, made it bearable, and allowed life to continue without leaving every heart broken. Amani, in her private moments, began to understand that forgiveness was not about erasing pain, nor was it about returning to what had been. It was about acknowledgement, reflection, and the slow acceptance that life, and love, can exist beyond punishment. She began to look at the village with new eyes, seeing the small gestures of care, the tentative understanding between neighbors, and the seeds of change growing quietly in the hearts of others. Cato discovered a similar path. Though he could not reach Amani, he could honor the love they had shared by living with integrity, by recognizing the lessons it had taught him, and by slowly forgiving those whose hands had enforced their separation. He understood that holding on to anger would only imprison him further. Instead, he chose reflection, compassion, and the hope that, in time, hearts, even hardened ones, could soften. Together, though apart, Amani and Cato's story became a catalyst for reflection within the village. The elders and families slowly realized that strict obedience had its costs, and that love, even forbidden love, had the power to teach, to illuminate, and to inspire growth. Forgiveness began not as a loud proclamation but as quiet acts, subtle shifts, and small changes in how people thought, acted, and treated one another. It was not easy. Forgiveness never is. Old habits, fear, and pride remained. Wounds lingered. But through patient reflection and time, the village began to see the value of mercy, empathy, and compassion alongside tradition. Amani and Cato's love had been punished, separated, and made to endure loss, but it had also planted the seeds of understanding. The slow path to forgiveness was hard-won, imperfect, yet sincere. The village, in its own cautious way, had begun to learn that the human heart could no longer be confined entirely by law, duty, or fear. And in that slow awakening there was hope. Hope that what had been broken might one day heal, hope that love, even when punished, could leave a lasting mark on hearts, and hope that the village might never again forget the lessons learned from two lives that dared to love against all odds. The years that followed were quiet but transformative. The village, once rigid and unyielding, carried the memory of Amani and Cato's love in every corner. The grove where they had met, the riverbank where whispers had been shared, even the small streets and markets where glances had once carried unspoken longing. What had once been a scandal had become a lesson, etched into the heart of the community. Amani had grown stronger, carrying both the sorrow of separation and the resilience that comes from enduring it. Though she had followed the village's expectations, a quiet defiance lingered within her, a remembrance that love, even when punished, could not be extinguished. Cato too had changed. His shoulders bore the weight of responsibility, but his heart remained tender, shaped by the depth of what he had experienced and the courage it had demanded. The village itself was no longer the same. The elders, once unquestioned in their authority, had begun to listen more carefully, to weigh mercy alongside law. Parents taught their children not only to obey, but also to understand the human heart. The story of the forbidden love became a quiet legend, a tale whispered to remind young and old alike that rules, while important, must be tempered with compassion. Small changes began to ripple through daily life. Arranged marriages were approached with care, with room for choice and consent. Expectations of obedience were softened by empathy, as families learned that rigid control could destroy more than it protected. The grove and the riverbank, once forbidden spaces, were no longer places of shame but symbols of courage, secrecy, and the power of love that endured despite impossible odds. Amani and Cato's story became something greater than themselves. It was no longer only a tale of forbidden love, it was a testament to human resilience, to the courage required to love in the face of fear, and to the profound impact one relationship can have on an entire community. The village remembered not just their defiance, but the lessons embedded in their suffering, that love is a force that cannot be entirely controlled, that hearts deserve consideration, and that mercy is a strength, not a weakness. Even in the absence of a shared life, the legacy of Amani and Cato persisted. Children grew up hearing their story, learning the value of empathy, and understanding that rules, while necessary, should never crush the human spirit. The elders themselves softened in time, recognizing that the rigidity of tradition without compassion could bring tragedy instead of honor. The memory of their love shaped the village's celebrations, its quiet reflections, and even its conflicts. People learned to pause before passing judgment, to consider the human heart behind every action, and to remember that love, though sometimes forbidden, sometimes dangerous, carries lessons no law can teach. In quiet moments, elders would speak of the grove, the riverbank, the night meetings that had once been hidden. Parents would remind their children that courage is measured not only in defiance but in the honesty of the heart. And though Amani and Cato's own lives had been shaped by separation and loss, their love remained a living force, unchanged by distance, immortal in memory and transformative in its effect on all who heard their story. The village, once bound entirely by fear and tradition, had begun to breathe in a new way. Compassion and understanding had taken root alongside the old rules. Respect for ancestors remained, but so too did respect for the human heart. Amani and Cato's love, punished, hidden, and tested by cruelty and fear, had changed the very fabric of the village. It had taught that love could endure beyond separation, beyond shame, and beyond judgment. It had shown that even when the world seeks to punish the heart, the memory of true connection can outlive fear. And so the story ended, not with bitterness or vengeance but with remembrance, hope, and quiet triumph. Two lives, bound by courage and love, had left an indelible mark. The village learned that love, even when forbidden, could transform not only hearts but generations. In the shadows of fear, in the memory of what had been lost, and in the lessons that endured, it was clear. Some loves are so powerful, so true that they cannot be erased, they can only inspire change. Amani and Cato's love had survived the impossible. And in surviving it had changed everything.